Now that we've talked a bit about GDP and how to account for it, how to compute it, we're going to talk now about what to do with the GDP number, particularly over long time periods, because changes in the price level through inflation or deflation, primarily inflation, really impact our understanding of what the value of actual, or what we call real GDP is, particularly from one time period to the next. I often say to students that most of us have older relatives, and we may have heard about what somebody paid for a car back in 1960 or what someone's salary was in 1950. And obviously it sounds hilarious and it's far off from the current day, mostly because there's been inflation, and we would have to make that to a real number in order to make these to be anything like an apples comparison. So this is the reason why we're accounting for these price level changes. First, a couple of definitions. We talk about the actual numbers that one is either producing or consuming or earning. We're talking about a nominal value. And the nominal value simply are the computed observed values of whatever the value is. In this case, GDP, but it could also be wages or anything. We call that a nominal value, even something like interest rates. If we adjust it for price level changes, i.e. adjust it for inflation, then we're talking about a real value. And so it's important for us to deal in particular with real value variables over long time periods. And the tool that's used to do that primarily is what's called a price index. And this is just a generic setup for what a price index looks like. There are a number of different price indices that are used, and your readings will focus a bit more on them, including the consumer price index, which tracks retail prices that are faced by urban consumers. There's a producer price index that tracks goods further up the production chain, including things like raw materials and goods being done. And there are a couple of other ones that are used, but for right now, the key thing that I want to focus on is what is a price index. And it's simply this: it takes the dollar value of goods, i.e. the prices of those goods, in some market basket, some hypothetical collection of goods, for some given year. Let's just focus on, say, the year 2014, just as an example, dividing those by the prices of goods in the same basket in some base year. And I just, for example purposes, used 2009. 2009 it could be used, or in the national income accounts, in the BLS data, oftentimes the series goes back to 1982 to 84, which means that we've had lots of price level changes for lots of goods. But this is just for illustrative purposes. We're talking about the price of goods now or recently or any time given in relation to those same goods at some time in the past. And because we're going to get some kind of value above 1 if these prices are higher than these, which has been our experience over a very long time period, then we're going to have some 1 point something or 2 point something that we're then going to multiply by 100. 100 is sort of the starting point for all index values, what we call index values that correspond to price indexes. And that is, if the price of all goods in 2014 were the exact same as the prices in goods in 2009, we have whatever those goods are divided by the same value. Anything divided by itself is 1. And we multiply that by 100, we would end up with 100. So in the base year then, in this example, 2009, the value of all these goods would be 100. And as we go up in time, we would expect, as prices go up, which is our normal experience, that this index value would rise. Setting it something above 100 is also sort of visually appealing because it would allow us to say if one index is 105 versus 100 in the base year, we can say, just eyeballing it, that prices have gone up by 5% in the time between that observed year and that base year. So it's appealing in that regard that we can sort of track it upward like a lot of indexes based on 100. So as an example of this, we've got a couple of years here, and notice when we're talking about getting to real, we're trying to get out of the distortions that are created by inflation. We're going to talk a bit more about inflation as we get going later in the course, in particular what to do about it, what the causes are. But for right now, let's just know that inflation can distort values, just as in the examples I gave earlier, particularly over long time periods. It's really hard to make comparisons without taking into account price level changes. And so if we're talking about real GDP, we're talking about taking the nominal GDP, and again, that's the observed measurable value, and dividing it by a deflator. The deflator is simply whatever you're going to get when you do this fraction. So in the year 2014, and these are hypothetical numbers, they're not real, if the total output of goods was 5850, divided by the prices in the base year, then 1.17 becomes that quotient, and that's the deflator. That's the value that then takes nominal values and brings them down to real values. We call it a deflator. And this value of 117 then becomes what's called an index value. In your textbook, it talks about taking index value in 100ths, and what it really means is taking the index value and dividing it back by 100, because you multiplied it by 100 to start with, just to make it look sort of visually interesting, and now you're going to take the 100 back in order to be able to divide it into that. So as a result, this is what we can say that between 2014 and 2009, what? Prices have gone up 17%. And so that's a good way of just sort of visualizing this. And excuse me, while there are some shortcomings in how we compute these, notably what goes in the market basket, nonetheless, we have other indices like the implicit price deflator, which captures many more goods and allows us to get even more accurate views of what is happening with GDP, with the price level. And then finally, if we are expecting prices to go up over time, which is a good expectation, for 2015 we might see the value of those same goods in the same market basket. And I realize the market basket changes over time, and every couple of years the Bureau of Labor Statistics will adjust these to put in things, newer things like iPhones, and to take out things like cassette players, for instance, in order to keep this relatively fresh. And obviously you've got some challenges over time when some of these goods don't exist, but the idea is to try to make it a representative view of what a typical household might buy, if in particular we're talking about the consumer price index. Right now, all I'm trying to illustrate here is what the use of a generic price index is to get a real value. So we might expect this to have gone up to make a deflator of 119. So we can say between 2015 and 2009, the base year, prices have gone up by 19%. And so this is one way of sort of viewing the issue of inflation, and notably taking out the effect of inflation, price level increases, by removing the effect of those, so that we are in fact trying to keep this analysis real as we go from one period to the next. And the final point on this is the idea that we're talking here specifically about real and nominal GDP, but whenever we take the inflation rate out of any calculation, we get some real value, whether it's real wages, real interest rates, real consumption, whatever the value is. We're oftentimes very much concerned with what's happening at the real level by taking out these rather arbitrary distortions that are caused by price level changes, either up or down, usually upward over time. And if any of this is unclear and you'd like further elaboration, I hope you'll feel free to contact me.